In the quiet countryside, a decaying farmhouse stands as a silent witness to a tragedy that shattered Claire and Lila Merrick's lives. Once inseparable, the sisters have spent years apart, estranged by pain, misunderstandings, and the scars left by a fire that claimed their childhood home, and with it, their parents. Now, an unexpected discovery draws them back to the Merrick farm, forcing them to confront the past they have tried to forget. As they work to rebuild the farm, Claire and Lila uncover more than just physical remnants of their family's life. Secrets long buried begin to surface, mysteries surrounding the fire, the suspicious circumstances of their parents' deaths, and the betrayals of people they once trusted. Their journey is fraught with conflict, as old wounds resurface and their bond is tested. Yet, amid the chaos, the sisters encounter unexpected kindness, a compassionate community offering support, a determined detective seeking justice, and even a poignant revelation about their parents' enduring love and sacrifice. Together, these forces lead Claire and Lila on a path of healing, one that will challenge their understanding of family, forgiveness, and the strength that lies in rebuilding what was broken. But as they piece together the truth, they must grapple with a haunting question. Can they truly overcome the pain of the past and reclaim the hope their parents left behind? The rain came down in steady sheets, washing over the small Oregon town like a forgotten promise. Claire Thompson sat by the window of her cramped apartment, her sewing machine whirring softly on the table beside her. Outside, the dim glow of streetlights flickered against the puddles pooling on the cracked asphalt. Inside, the apartment was cold, the hum of the space heater barely taking the chill off the air. Claire's life was one of quiet routine. By day, she worked at a local alteration shop, mending hems and resizing dresses for people who rarely looked her in the eye. By night, she worked on small commissions from home, stitching together scraps of fabric to form something whole, a process she often wished could apply to her own life. Her apartment reflected her solitary existence. The walls were a dull beige, sparsely decorated with thrifted paintings and a few shelves lined with spools of thread and fabric remnants. A single armchair sat in the corner, its upholstery frayed. The only personal touch was a small wooden box on her bedside table, which held her most precious possession, a delicate, tarnished locket. Claire opened the box now, her fingers trembling slightly. She took out the locket, running her thumb over the worn engraving on its surface. It read, "Always together." The locket was the only connection she had to a past she could barely remember. She didn't know who had given it to her or why it felt so heavy with meaning. All she knew was that it was hers, and it had been with her since the day she was abandoned. She closed her eyes, letting fragments of memories surface, hazy images of a swing set, a woman's gentle laugh, and a stormy night. But the memories were like shadows, impossible to grasp. She sighed and opened the locket, revealing the faded photo inside. It showed two young girls, perhaps 4 or 5 years old, standing in front of a farmhouse. For as long as she could remember, Claire had wondered who the other girl was. A sister? A cousin? A childhood friend? She had no answers, only questions that felt too distant to ever resolve. The rain intensified, its rhythmic tapping on the window, pulling Claire from her thoughts. She set the locket down and turned back to her sewing machine, focusing on the fabric under her needle. The steady hum of the machine was soothing, a small reminder that she could create something tangible, even if her own life felt threadbare. Later that night, Claire sat in her armchair, wrapped in a worn quilt. The rain had eased, leaving the streets outside eerily quiet. She stared at the locket on the table, the photo inside seeming to call to her. For the first time in years, she felt a flicker of determination. She grabbed her laptop, an old model that took several minutes to boot up. She typed into the search bar, "farmhouses in Oregon 20 years ago." The results were overwhelming, dozens of listings and old photos that blurred together. But then one caught her eye, a farmhouse with peeling white paint and a rusted windmill in the background. It looked eerily similar to the one in her locket. The listing included a name, the Merrick family farm. Claire's heart raced as she clicked on it. The accompanying article was brief, but devastating. It described a family tragedy that had occurred over 2 decades ago, a fire that claimed the lives of the parents and left 2 young daughters missing. Claire's breath caught. Could this be her? Could she be one of the missing Merrick girls? The idea seemed impossible, yet something in her heart told her it was true. Her hands trembled as she scrolled through the article, searching for more information. It mentioned the farmhouse was now abandoned and that the family's belongings had been auctioned off years ago. There was no mention of the girls' fates. Claire leaned back in her chair, the weight of the discovery pressing down on her. She felt an ache she couldn't explain, a longing for something she'd never had, but somehow missed deeply. The rain began again, soft and steady, as if the sky was weeping with her. The next day, Claire could barely focus at work. She fumbled with needles and pins, her mind consumed by the article and the locket. Her boss, Mrs. Keller, a no-nonsense woman in her 60s, noticed Claire's distraction. "You're making a mess of that hem," Mrs. Keller said, her voice sharp but not unkind. "What's going on with you today?" Claire hesitated. She wasn't used to sharing personal matters, but the question felt like an invitation. I think I found something about my past," she said softly. Mrs. Keller's expression softened. "Well, that's a good thing, isn't it?" "I don't know. It's overwhelming," Claire admitted. Mrs. Keller nodded thoughtfully. "Sometimes the past has a way of catching up with us, whether we're ready for it or not. Just take it one step at a time." Claire nodded, grateful for the advice. That evening, as she walked home through the rain, Claire found herself drawn to a small church she often passed but never entered. The light spilling from its stained glass windows was warm and inviting, a stark contrast to the cold night. She hesitated at the door, her fingers grazing the locket around her neck. Something about the church felt familiar, though she couldn't place why. Finally, she stepped inside. The interior was quiet, the air filled with the faint scent of candle wax and old wood. A lone figure stood near the altar, a priest with silver hair and kind eyes. He turned as she entered, his face lighting up with a welcoming smile. "Good evening," he said. "What brings you here on such a rainy night?" Claire hesitated, then held up the locket. "I think this might be connected to my past," she said, her voice trembling. The priest's eyes softened as he stepped closer to examine the locket. "That's a beautiful piece," he said, "and it seems to hold a lot of meaning for you." "It's all I have," Claire admitted. "I don't know where I came from or who I am. I found something about a family, the Merricks. I think I might be one of their daughters." The priest's expression grew thoughtful. "The Merrick family? I remember hearing about that tragedy. Such a heartbreaking loss." He paused. "There may be some records in our archives that could help you. Would you like to take a look?" Claire nodded, a glimmer of hope sparking in her chest. Father Allen led her to a small room lined with shelves of old books and folders. As he searched for the records, he shared stories about the church and the community, his voice soothing and kind. When he finally found a folder marked Merrick Family, he handed it to Claire with a gentle smile. "I hope this helps," he said. "And remember, whatever you find, you're not alone." Claire's throat tightened as she took the folder. For the first time in years, she felt a sense of connection not just to her past, but to the kindness of a stranger who seemed to care about her journey. As she walked home that night, the locket felt lighter around her neck, as if it, too, had found a bit of peace. Claire didn't know what she would uncover in the days ahead, but for the first time, she felt ready to face it. The rain had stopped by morning, but the sky remained a dull gray as Claire sat at her kitchen table. The folder Father Allen had given her spread open in front of her. Her small apartment felt quieter than usual, the soft ticking of the clock on the wall the only sound as she pored over the yellowed papers. Inside the folder was a collection of news clippings, handwritten notes, and faded photographs. The first article caught her attention immediately. Tragedy at the Merrick family farm. Parents perish, daughters missing. The accompanying photo showed the farmhouse from her locket. It was eerie to see it in such stark detail, the peeling paint, the crooked shutters, and the familiar windmill standing watch in the background. The article detailed the fire that had claimed the lives of the Merrick parents, Thomas and Eleanor, but no trace of the daughters had ever been found. Authorities had suspected the girls were taken during the chaos, but no leads had surfaced. Claire's stomach churned as she read, her fingers trembling as she turned to the next page. There were notes from community members, pleas for information, and a reward poster offering money for the safe return of the Merrick sisters. But the trail went cold after that. No further records of the daughters, no evidence of what had happened to them. Annie and Emily Merrick, Claire whispered, her eyes scanning the names over and over again. Could Annie be her? And Emily. What had happened to her? The idea of a sister made Claire's chest ache in a way she didn't fully understand. She pressed her hand to her locket, as if it could somehow reassure her. All her life, she had felt the absence of someone, but she had never been able to name it. Now she could. The thought of Emily sent Claire spiraling into memories. She couldn't fully grasp flashes of laughter, a hand gripping hers tightly, a voice calling her name. She closed her eyes, trying to piece the fragments together, but they remained elusive. Her focus was broken by a soft knock at the door. Startled, Claire looked up, unsure who it could be. Visitors were rare in her quiet life. She rose and opened the door to find Father Allen standing there, his silver hair glinting in the muted light. I hope I'm not interrupting, he said gently, holding up a small bundle wrapped in cloth. No, not at all, Claire said, stepping aside to let him in. I found something else after you left last night, Father Allen explained, setting the bundle on the table. He unwrapped it carefully to reveal a small wooden cross, its edges smoothed by time. This was found at the Merrick farmhouse after the fire, he said. I thought it might be connected to the family story. I wasn't sure if it would mean anything to you, but I felt it was worth sharing. Claire stared at the cross, her heart racing. It felt familiar, though she couldn't say why. She picked it up, running her fingers over its worn surface. There was a faint carving on the back, almost illegible, for Annie and Emily. Her breath caught. It's us, she whispered. Father Allen nodded, his expression thoughtful. It seems this piece was meant to find its way back to you. I can't imagine what it must feel like to uncover all of this, but know that you don't have to face it alone. Claire felt a lump rise in her throat. Thank you, she said, her voice barely audible. You're very brave, he said. I know it can be overwhelming, but perhaps this is the start of finding answers, and maybe even healing. After Father Allen left, Claire sat back down at the table, clutching the cross in one hand and the locket in the other. Her world had shifted overnight, and she wasn't sure how to steady herself. But there was no denying the pull she felt to keep searching, to follow the threads that seemed to be leading her somewhere she couldn't yet see. The following weekend, Claire found herself standing on the steps of St. Luke's orphanage, a brick building that looked as worn and weary as the stories it held. It was the place mentioned in the Merrick file as the temporary shelter for displaced children in the area after the fire. She hesitated at the door, her nerves fraying. What if they didn't have any records? What if they did? The weight of possibility pressed heavily on her chest. Summoning her courage, Claire stepped inside. The air smelled faintly of wax and old paper, and the walls were lined with faded photographs of children over the years. A woman in her 50s, with short gray hair and a warm smile, approached her. Can I help you? The woman asked. Yes, Claire said, her voice unsteady. I'm looking for information about the Merrick sisters. They might have stayed here after the fire in 1998. The woman's smile faltered slightly, replaced by a look of understanding. I remember the Merrick case, she said. It was such a tragedy. Please, come with me. She led Claire to a small office and began sorting through old files, her movements efficient yet gentle. I'm Margaret Green, she said. I've been here for 30 years, so I've seen a lot of stories come and go. But the Merrick girls, they always stayed with me. 2 little ones just gone. Claire's throat tightened as she nodded, unable to speak. Margaret eventually found a dusty file labeled Merrick, Annie, and Emily. She opened it carefully, scanning the contents. Annie was brought here, Margaret said. That's you, isn't it? Claire nodded, tears filling her eyes. But Emily, Margaret continued, flipping through the pages. It says here that she was adopted almost immediately, just a few weeks after the fire. A couple from New York took her in. Her name was changed to Lila Harding. Claire's heart clenched. Emily's alive? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Margaret smiled softly. It seems so. and it looks like the couple kept in touch with the orphanage for a few years after the adoption. There may still be a way to find her. Margaret handed Claire the file, her expression kind. You've come this far. I believe you'll find her. The kindness in Margaret's words and actions filled a space in Claire's heart that had long been empty. For so many years, she had felt invisible, untethered. But now, these unexpected connections with Father Allen, with Margaret, were helping her feel seen. Claire left the orphanage with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. Emily Lila was out there, and Claire was determined to find her. As she walked home, the rain began again, soft and steady, but it no longer felt heavy. Instead, it felt like a cleansing, a promise of renewal. Claire clutched the locket around her neck, her other hand holding the wooden cross. She didn't know what the future would hold, but she knew she wouldn't stop until she found her sister. The rain tapered off by morning, leaving a soft mist that clung to the streets of the quiet town. Claire sat by the window of her apartment, a steaming cup of coffee untouched in her hands. The file from St. Luke's orphanage lay open on the table, and her heart thudded as she reread the name, Lila Harding. The thought of Emily Lila living a life entirely separate from hers was both exhilarating and terrifying. What if Lila had no memory of her? What if she didn't want to reconnect? The question swirled in Claire's mind, casting shadows over the fragile hope she had begun to feel. Her eyes drifted to the sewing machine in the corner, its presence a familiar anchor in her otherwise uncertain life. Needing to busy her hands, Claire pulled a pile of fabric scraps from a basket and sat down to work. The rhythmic hum of the machine soothed her, and she lost herself in the process of stitching the pieces together. As the pattern began to take shape, she paused, her breath catching. Without consciously realizing it, she had sewn a design that resembled the carving on the wooden cross Father Allen had given her, two intertwining vines surrounding the words, for Annie and Emily. Claire stared at the fabric, her fingers brushing over the stitching. How many times had she repeated this pattern without understanding its origin? Was it a memory buried deep in her mind, or something even more intangible, a connection to Emily that had endured despite their years apart? The thought gave her courage. She folded the fabric carefully and placed it in her bag, along with the locket and the cross. Then she sat down at her laptop. The search for Lila Harding wasn't easy. The file from the orphanage provided little more than the name of the adoptive couple and a vague reference to New York. Claire scrolled through pages of search results, feeling her hope wane with each dead end. But then an image stopped her cold. It was a photograph of a young woman standing in front of a grand piano, her expression serene. Her dark hair was pulled back, and she wore a simple dress. But what drew Claire's attention was the delicate chain around her neck. The pendant was partially hidden, but Claire recognized it instantly. It was the other half of her locket. The caption beneath the photo read, Lila Harding, classical pianist, Carnegie Hall debut. Claire's hands shook as she clicked the link. The article detailed Lila's rise as a gifted pianist, her studies at prestigious conservatories, and her upcoming recital in New York City. The recital was just 2 weeks away. Claire leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. The thought of traveling to New York to confront her sister filled her with equal parts excitement and dread. Could she just walk up to Lila after a performance and say, I'm your sister? The chime of her phone broke her thoughts. It was a message from Father Allen. Whatever you decide, remember you don't have to do it alone. His words brought tears to Claire's eyes. The past few days had felt like an avalanche of revelations, but the kindness of Father Allen and Margaret Green had kept her steady. She thought of Margaret's encouraging words at the orphanage. You've come this far. I believe you'll find her. Claire made up her mind. That evening, she returned to the church. Father Allen greeted her with his usual warmth, offering her tea as they sat in the quiet pews. I found her, Claire said, her voice trembling with emotion. Her name is Lila now. She's a pianist in New York. Father Allen's face lit up with a mixture of surprise and joy. That's wonderful news. Are you planning to see her? Claire hesitated. I want to, but what if she doesn't remember me? What if she doesn't want to know me? Father Allen rested a hand on her shoulder, his touch steady and reassuring. You'll never know unless you try. And even if it doesn't go as you hope, you'll have taken a brave step toward understanding your past and yourself. Claire nodded, feeling a sense of calm settle over her. I think I'll go to her recital. It feels right. Then go, Father Allen said with a smile. And trust that whatever happens, you're not alone in this. Over the next week, Claire prepared for the journey with nervous anticipation. She booked a bus ticket to New York and packed her belongings carefully, including the locket and the fabric she had stitched. The night before she left, there was another knock at her door. To her surprise, it was Margaret Green, holding a small envelope. I thought you might need this, Margaret said, handing Claire the envelope. Inside was a hand-drawn map of the Merrick farmhouse, marked with notes and dates. It's from the family's things, Margaret explained. I thought it might help you feel connected to where you came from. Claire's voice wavered as she thanked Margaret. The unexpected kindness of these strangers, now friends, gave her the strength to face what lay ahead. The journey to New York was long and tiring, but Claire's resolve never wavered. As the city skyline came into view, her heart raced with a mixture of fear and hope. When the bus pulled into the station, she clutched her bag tightly and made her way to the address listed for the recital. The venue was grand, with glittering chandeliers and a marble staircase that seemed to stretch endlessly upward. Claire felt out of place in her simple coat and worn shoes, but she pressed on. Inside, the air buzzed with excitement as the audience filled the rows of plush seats. Claire took her place near the back, her hands gripping the edges of her chair. The lights dimmed, and the room fell silent. A spotlight illuminated the stage as a young woman stepped forward and sat at the piano. It was Lila. Claire's breath caught as she watched her sister play. The music was hauntingly beautiful, a melody that seemed to echo something deep within Claire's soul. Tears streamed down her face as she listened, the notes weaving a story of longing and connection that words could never capture. When the recital ended, Claire waited until the crowd had thinned before approaching the stage. Lila stood by the piano, speaking with a group of admirers. Claire's hands trembled as she reached in her bag and pulled out the locket. She waited until Lila was alone, then stepped forward. "Excuse me," Claire said, her voice barely above a whisper. Lila turned, her expression polite but distant. "Yes." Claire held up the locket, her heart pounding. "I think this belongs to you." Lila's eyes widened as she stared at the locket. Her hand flew to her own necklace, and she pulled out the matching half. "Where did you get that?" Lila asked, her voice shaking. "It's a long story," Claire said, her tears falling freely now. "But I think I'm your sister." For a moment, Lila's face was unreadable, her expression caught between shock and disbelief. The bustling concert hall seemed to fade around them as Claire held out the locket, her hand trembling. "My sister?" Lila repeated, her voice barely audible. Her fingers brushed the locket around her neck as if confirming its presence, then darted to the matching piece Claire held. Claire nodded, her heart pounding. "I think we were separated after the fire. Your name was Emily, mine was Annie." Lila's breath hitched, and she glanced around, as if searching for a familiar landmark in uncharted territory. The crowd was thinning, but a few stragglers lingered near the back, their murmured conversations blending into the background noise. "Can we talk somewhere quieter?" Lila finally asked, her voice still unsteady. Claire nodded, her relief mingled with nerves. Lila led her down a side hallway, past framed concert posters and rehearsal rooms, until they reached a small lounge tucked behind the stage. The room was warm and intimate, with plush chairs and a table scattered with programs and sheet music. Lila gestured for Claire to sit, but she remained standing, her arms crossed protectively. "I don't understand," Lila said, her tone cautious but not unkind. "How did you find me?" Claire swallowed, her throat dry. She fumbled to explain, starting with the locket and her visit to St. Luke's orphanage, then describing the article she'd found about Lila's recital. "I wasn't sure if it was really you," Claire admitted, her voice trembling. "But when I saw the locket in the photo, I had to come." Lila stared at her for a long moment, her eyes scanning Claire's face as if searching for a resemblance. "I've worn this locket my whole life," she said finally, her voice soft. "My adoptive parents, they told me it was all I had left of my family. but they never mentioned a sister. Claire felt a pang of sorrow at Lila's words. I didn't know about you either, she said. I've been searching for answers for years. I only found out about the fire in our family a few weeks ago. Lila sank into one of the chairs, her hands gripping the armrests. Her composed exterior cracked just slightly, revealing the vulnerability beneath. This is a lot to take in. Claire sat across from her, her voice gentle. I know. It's a lot for me too. But I've felt lost for so long. And now that I've found you, I can't help but feel like this is where I'm meant to be. Lila looked down at her hands, silent for a moment. Then she reached for the locket around her neck, pulling it off carefully. She placed it on the table next to Claire's half, the two pieces finally reunited. The engraving was clear now, always together. Do you remember anything? Claire asked hesitantly. About before the fire? Lila shook her head. Not much, just flashes. A swing set, I think. A woman's voice singing. And someone holding my hand. Her voice faltered, and she glanced up at Claire. Was that you? Claire's throat tightened. I don't know, she admitted. I hope so. For the first time, Lila's guarded expression softened. She picked up the two halves of the locket and studied them. It's strange, she said. I've always felt like something was missing, but I could never explain it. Now, maybe this is it. Claire smiled, the knot in her chest loosening just slightly. I felt the same way, she said. Lila's eyes flicked to the fabric bundle peeking out of Claire's bag. What's that? She asked. Claire hesitated, then pulled out the piece. She had stitched a recreation of the carving on the cross Father Allen had given her. She unfolded it and placed it on the table. I think it's something I remembered without realizing it, Claire said. The cross has our names on it. For Annie and Emily. Lila reached out to touch the fabric, her fingers tracing the intricate design. Her expression was unreadable, but her eyes shone with unshed tears. This is beautiful, she said softly. Claire watched her, feeling a mixture of relief and uncertainty. They had found each other, but there were still so many unanswered questions. After a long silence, Lila looked up. My adoptive parents live nearby, she said. They're wonderful people, and I know they want to meet you. Maybe they can help fill in some of the blanks. Claire's heart leapt at the offer, though she couldn't hide her nervousness. I'd like that, she said. Lila smiled faintly, then glanced at the clock on the wall. It's late, she said. I have a rehearsal in the morning, but maybe we can meet tomorrow. Of course, Claire said quickly. Lila rose, her movements graceful even in her exhaustion. She reached for the locket halves, hesitating for a moment before handing one back to Claire. We'll figure this out, Lila said, her voice steadying. Claire smiled, clutching the locket tightly. Thank you. As she left the concert hall, Claire felt a mixture of hope and trepidation. Reconnecting with Lila had been overwhelming, but it was also the first step towards something she had longed for her entire life. She returned to her modest hotel room and lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling. The city buzzed faintly outside, a backdrop to her racing thoughts. The next day, Claire met Lila at a cafe near the park. The conversation was tentative at first, but as they shared stories of their lives, a tentative bond began to form. Lila's adoptive parents, the Hardings, welcomed Claire into their home that evening. They were warm and gracious, their love for Lila evident in every interaction. We always hoped Lila's family would find her, Mrs. Harding said, tears glistening in her eyes. This is a gift we never expected. As the evening wore on, Claire felt a sense of belonging she hadn't known in years. The Hardings treated her with kindness and understanding, and Lila seemed to relax in their presence. After dinner, Lila led Claire to a small room lined with books and framed photographs. She picked up a worn journal and handed it to Claire. This belonged to my birth mother, Lila said. The Hardings kept it for me, hoping I'd want it someday. Maybe it has something that can help us. Claire opened the journal carefully, her fingers trembling as she read the neat handwriting on the first page. For my daughters, Annie and Emily, may you always know you are loved. Claire's eyes filled with tears as she looked up at Lila. This is our story, she whispered. Lila nodded, her voice barely audible. It's time we found the rest of it. The journal lay open on Claire's lap, its delicate pages weathered but still intact. The handwriting, though faded in places, carried a precision that spoke of care and love. Claire's fingers trembled as she turned the first page, her breath catching at the opening lines. For my daughters, Annie and Emily, this journal is my heart, my voice, my hope for you both. If you are reading this, it means life has taken a turn I could never have imagined. But remember, you are never alone. You are loved, always. Lila sat beside her, her expression unreadable as her eyes flicked between Claire and the journal. The room was quiet, the muffled city sounds outside a distant hum. The warmth of the Hardings' home felt like a protective cocoon, but the weight of the moment pressed heavily on both sisters. Should we read it together? Lila asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Claire nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. She glanced at the next entry, dated just weeks before the fire. Today, Emily climbed the old oak tree in the backyard while Annie cheered her on from below. My heart nearly stopped, but their laughter was like sunshine breaking through clouds. I wish I could freeze these moments, keep them safe forever. The words painted a vivid picture, and Claire felt a flicker of recognition. She could almost hear the laughter, the rustling of leaves, and the steady encouragement of her younger self calling up to her sister. Do you remember anything like that? Lila asked, leaning forward. Claire hesitated. Not exactly, she admitted. But it feels familiar, like something just out of reach. They continued reading, the entries weaving a tapestry of love and devotion. Their mother, Eleanor Merrick, had filled the journal with stories of their early years' birthday parties, summer picnics, quiet nights by the fire. But as the entries neared the date of the fire, the tone shifted. Thomas has been on edge lately, worried about the debts piling up from the farm. He says he has a plan, but he won't tell me the details. I trust him, but I can't help feeling uneasy. Lila frowned, her fingers brushing the page. Do you think this has anything to do with the fire? Claire bit her lip, her mind racing. Maybe, she said, or it could just be unrelated stress. Farming is a hard life. The next entry was even more troubling. Someone came to the house today, asking questions about Thomas's business dealings. I didn't like the way he looked at the girls, as if he was measuring something. Thomas told me not to worry, but I can't shake the feeling that danger is closer than we realize. Claire's chest tightened as she read. What if the fire wasn't an accident? The thought sent a shiver down Lila's spine. But why? What could they have wanted? The answer didn't come from the journal, at least not immediately. The remaining pages contained a few more anecdotes, scattered thoughts, and half-finished sentences, as if Eleanor had been interrupted mid-thought. Near the back of the journal, however, they found a folded piece of paper tucked between the pages. Claire opened it carefully, revealing a crude map of the Merrick property. Certain areas were marked with symbols and notes: creek, windmill, storage barn. One marking, a star near the back of the property, stood out. What do you think it means? Lila asked, leaning closer. Claire shook her head. I don't know, but it feels important. Their conversation was interrupted by Mrs. Harding's soft knock on the door. I thought you might like some tea, she said, carrying a tray with 2 steaming cups. Thank you, Claire said, her voice faltering as she quickly wiped her eyes. Mrs. Harding smiled gently, her gaze lingering on the journal. Finding pieces of the past can be both a comfort and a burden, she said. But it's part of the journey. You're brave for facing it. After Mrs. Harding left, the sisters sat in thoughtful silence, sipping their tea. Claire's mind buzzed with questions. The journal had given them glimpses of their mother's thoughts and fears, but it also raised new mysteries. We need to go back, Claire said finally, breaking the silence. Lila looked at her, confused. Back where? To the farmhouse, Claire said, her voice steady. If there's anything left, it might help us understand what happened. Lila's eyes widened. You think the map leads to something? I don't know, Claire admitted. But we have to try. The following morning, the sisters set out for the small rural town where the Merrick farmhouse once stood. The drive was long, and the landscape grew more desolate as they left the city behind. Fields stretched endlessly on either side of the road, dotted with weathered barns and sagging fences. When they arrived, Claire felt a strange mix of familiarity and unease. The farmhouse was in ruins, the charred remains overgrown with weeds and wildflowers. The windmill still stood, its blades creaking in the breeze, a solitary sentinel guarding the memories of the past. Lila hesitated as they stepped out of the car, her eyes fixed on the crumbling structure. "I don't know if I can do this," she said softly. Claire reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "We'll do it together," she said. They followed the map's markings, starting at the creek and working their way toward the windmill. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and decaying wood, and every step felt like unearthing a buried part of themselves. Finally, they reached the spot marked with a star. It was near the remnants of the storage barn, where the earth looked disturbed even after all these years. Lila knelt down, brushing away debris with trembling hands. "Do you think there's something buried here?" Claire nodded, her heart pounding. Only one way to find out. With a borrowed shovel from the car, Claire began digging. The work was hard and slow, but determination fueled her every movement. Lila helped, her usually graceful hands now covered in dirt. After what felt like hours, the blade struck something solid. Claire and Lila exchanged a glance before carefully clearing the remaining soil. They uncovered a small wooden box, its edges worn but intact. With bated breath, Claire opened the box. Inside was a bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon, a few photographs, and a ledger filled with handwritten notes. Lila picked up one of the photographs, her eyes widening. "That's us," she whispered. "And Mom and Dad." The image showed the Merrick family standing in front of the farmhouse, their smiles frozen in time. Claire felt tears sting her eyes as she traced the outlines of their parents' faces, her heart aching with both loss and gratitude. The letters and ledger contained more pieces of the puzzle, references to financial struggles, mysterious debts, and warnings from neighbors about dangerous men. "It wasn't an accident," Claire said quietly, her voice trembling. "Someone set that fire." Lila's jaw tightened, her eyes burning with a mix of anger and determination. "Then we need to find out who and why." As they stood there, clutching the remnants of their past, the sun broke through the clouds, casting a golden light over the ruins. The warmth on their skin felt like a silent reassurance, a reminder that even in the face of loss, they were not alone. The journey to uncover the truth was far from over, but for the first time, Claire and Lila felt a sense of unity and purpose. They had each other, and together, they would face whatever lay ahead. The car ride back to the Hardings' home was steeped in silence, punctuated only by the sound of tires on the uneven road. The box they had unearthed sat on Claire's lap, its contents carefully secured, but the weight of what it represented pressed down on both sisters. Lila glanced at Claire, her hands gripping the steering wheel. "Do you think the fire was because of the debts?" "It seems likely," Claire said softly, running her fingers over the photograph they had found. The image of their family felt like a fragile bridge to a past she was still struggling to piece together. If someone wanted to collect or silence Dad, maybe... Her voice trailed off, unwilling to give shape to the darker possibilities swirling in her mind. Lila nodded grimly. "Who would do something like that? Over money?" Claire didn't answer. She stared out the window as the fields gave way to suburban streets, her thoughts tangled in the mystery. When they reached the Hardings' home, the sisters retreated to Lila's room to examine the box in detail. Mrs. Harding offered tea and warm smiles, her quiet support a balm for their frayed nerves. As the two sisters spread the items out on Lila's desk, the pieces began to form a clearer picture. The ledger revealed a pattern of loans and overdue payments, along with cryptic initials scrawled in the margins. The letters were even more telling, their father's tone shifting from hopeful to desperate. "I never wanted this for us," one letter read, "but I had no choice. They're not men you can refuse. I'll make it right, Eleanor. I promise." Lila's face hardened as she read the words. "He was trying to protect us." Claire nodded. "But from who? And why set the fire?" They combed through the photographs next. Most were of their family snapshots of sunny afternoons, birthdays, and quiet moments on the farm. But one picture stood out, It showed their father standing next to two unfamiliar men, their expressions serious. The photograph was faded, but the distinctive scar on one man's cheek was clear. "Do you recognize them?" Claire asked, her brow furrowed. Lila shook her head. "No, but this feels important. Maybe we can find out who they are," Claire said. The next morning, they decided to seek help. Father Allen had always been a source of wisdom, and his connection to the town's history made him the natural choice. They packed the box carefully and drove to the church. Father Allen greeted them warmly, his face lighting up when he saw the box. "You found something," he said, motioning them to follow him into his office. Once they were seated, Claire and Lila laid out the items, explaining everything they had discovered. Father Allen listened intently, his expression growing more serious with each revelation. When Claire showed him the photograph of their father with the two men, Father Allen's face darkened. "I know who that is," he said, tapping the image. "The man with the scar, his name is Victor Kane. He used to run a less than reputable loan operation in town. A lot of families fell into his trap when times got tough." "Was he dangerous?" Lila asked, her voice sharp. Father Allen sighed. "Yes, he had a reputation for making examples of people who couldn't pay." Claire's stomach churned. "Do you think he could have?" Father Allen's silence was answer enough. "Do you know where he is now?" Claire asked. "He disappeared years ago," Father Allen said. "But his name still carries weight in certain circles." The sisters exchanged a glance. The truth was closer than ever, but it was also more dangerous. "Can we find him?" Lila pressed. Father Allen hesitated, then nodded. "There's someone who might know. A man named Robert Ashford. He used to work for Kane, but left the business after an argument. He lives out on Pine Hollow Road now, keeping to himself. Can you introduce us?" Claire asked. "I'll write him a letter," Father Allen said, reaching for a pen. "But be careful. This isn't a path to walk lightly." The sisters left the church with a mixture of hope and trepidation. The idea of confronting someone connected to the fire filled Claire with unease, but she couldn't turn back now. The next afternoon, they drove out to Pine Hollow Road, following Father Allen's instructions. The road wound through dense woods, the trees casting long shadows that danced across the car. When they reached Ashford's house, a modest cabin surrounded by overgrown brush, Claire hesitated. "Are you sure about this?" Lila asked, her voice uncertain. Claire nodded, gripping the photograph tightly. "We have to know." They approached the front door and knocked. After a long pause, the door creaked open, revealing a gaunt man with silver hair and piercing eyes. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice gruff. "We're Claire and Lila," Claire said, her voice steady. "Father Allen sent us. We're looking for answers about Victor Kane." At the mention of Kane's name, Ashford stiffened. His eyes narrowed, scanning their faces before landing on the photograph in Claire's hand. "Why are you asking about him?" Claire took a deep breath. "He might have been involved in something that happened to our family, a fire on the Merrick farm 15 years ago." Ashford's expression softened, and he stepped aside. "Come in," he said. The inside of the cabin was sparse but clean, with a single table and a worn armchair by the fireplace. Ashford gestured for them to sit, then poured himself a cup of coffee, his hands trembling slightly. "I left Kane's operation years ago," he began, his voice low. "But I remember your father. He borrowed money to keep the farm afloat, but he couldn't keep up with the payments. Kane sent me to collect a few times, but your dad always managed to scrape something together until he didn't." Ashford paused, his gaze distant. "The night of the fire, I heard Kane talking about sending a message. I didn't know what he meant at the time, but when I heard about the fire the next day..." He shook his head, his expression pained. "I'm sorry for what happened to your family. I didn't know it would go that far." Claire's heart ached at the confirmation of her worst fears. "Do you know where Kane is now?" Ashford hesitated, then nodded. "Last I heard, he was hiding out near the old quarry. But be careful. He won't go down without a fight." The sisters exchanged a determined look. The pieces of the puzzle were finally coming together, but the danger was more real than ever. As they left the cabin, Claire gripped Lila's hand tightly. "We're close," she said. "We'll find the truth, and we'll face it together." The road ahead was uncertain, but the bond between them had grown stronger with each step. For the first time, Claire felt a flicker of hope that justice and healing were within reach. The air near the old quarry was thick with dampness, carrying the earthy scent of moss and decay. The sun hung low in the sky as Claire and Lila parked their car at the edge of the overgrown lot. Trees loomed around them, their branches gnarled and twisted, as if they had absorbed the secrets of this place. Claire gripped the photograph of Victor Kane tightly, her palms clammy. Lila adjusted her scarf, her hands trembling despite the late afternoon warmth. "Are we ready for this?" Lila asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "No," Claire admitted, her voice steadier than she felt. "But we have to try." Father Allen's words echoed in her mind. This isn't a path to walk lightly. The sisters stepped out of the car, their shoes crunching against the gravel. The path leading into the quarry was narrow and uneven, flanked by dense bushes that seemed to close in around them. Each step felt heavier, the weight of what they were about to face pressing down on their shoulders. The sound of trickling water reached them as they neared the center of the quarry. Then, through a break in the trees, they saw it. A small, dilapidated shack perched precariously near the edge of a stagnant pond. "That has to be it," Claire said, her heart pounding. Lila nodded, her expression resolute. "Let's go." As they approached the shack, Claire's thoughts raced. What if Kane refused to talk? What if he reacted with violence? She pushed the fears aside, focusing on the one thing that mattered, the truth. The sister stopped a few feet from the door. Claire raised her hand to knock, hesitated, and then forced herself to rap firmly against the wood. A shuffling sound came from inside, followed by a raspy voice. "Who's there?" "Claire and Lila Merrick," Claire called, her voice shaking slightly. "We need to talk." The door creaked open, revealing a man who looked older than his years. Victor Kane's face was lined with deep creases, his eyes sunken but sharp. The scar on his cheek was unmistakable, a jagged mark that seemed to mirror his hardened demeanor. "What do you want?" Kane asked, his tone wary. "We're here about the fire on our family's farm," Claire said, her voice firm. "We know you were involved." Kane stiffened, his hand gripping the edge of the door. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said gruffly. "We found this," Lila interjected, holding up the photograph of Kane with their father. "You knew him. You came to our property." Kane's eyes darted to the photograph, his jaw tightening. "That was a long time ago. Leave it in the past where it belongs." "The past doesn't stay buried," Claire said, stepping closer. "We deserve answers. Our family deserves justice." Kane sighed, his shoulders sagging. "You don't want to dig into this," he muttered. "It's not going to bring anyone back." "We're not leaving until you tell us the truth," Lila said, her voice steady despite the tension crackling in the air. Kane stared at them for a long moment, then stepped back, motioning for them to enter. The inside of the shack was as grim as its exterior bare walls, a sagging mattress, and a rickety table covered with empty bottles. Kane sank into a battered chair, rubbing his temples. "What do you want to know?" he asked, his tone resigned. "Why?" Claire asked, her voice trembling. "Why was our family targeted? Why set the fire?" Kane hesitated, then leaned forward, his eyes dark and unflinching. "Your father owed money. A lot of money. He was behind on payments, and I was sent to collect. But when I got there, he didn't have it." Claire felt a surge of anger, but kept her voice steady. "So you set the fire?" "To send a message." Kane shook his head. "It wasn't supposed to go that far," he said, his voice quieter now. "I only meant to scare him. Light a small fire near the barn, enough to make him think twice about ignoring us. But the wind caught it, spread it faster than I expected. I didn't mean for anyone to get hurt." Lila's face paled. "You didn't mean for anyone to get hurt?" she repeated, her voice rising. "Our parents died. We lost everything." Kane flinched at her words, his expression pained. "I didn't know anyone was inside," he said, his voice breaking. I thought they'd be out in the fields. I never wanted this." Claire's hands clenched into fists. "You destroyed our family," she said, her voice heavy with grief. "And you just disappeared? No consecuencias." Kane looked away, his guilt written plainly on his face. "I've paid for it every day since," he said quietly. "You think I haven't been haunted by what I did? I lost everything to my business, my freedom, my soul. For a moment, the room was silent, the weight of Kane's confession hanging heavy in the air. What now? Lila asked, her voice shaking. Claire took a deep breath, her thoughts churning. Part of her wanted to scream, to lash out at Kane for the pain he had caused. But another part of her, a quieter, stronger part, knew that vengeance wouldn't heal the wounds he had inflicted. You need to turn yourself in, Claire said finally, her voice steady. You need to face the consequences of what you did. Kane nodded slowly, his expression weary. Maybe it's time, he said. I'm tired of running. The sisters exchanged a glance, a silent agreement passing between them. They had come seeking answers, and though the truth was painful, it was also liberating. As they left the shack, Claire felt an unexpected sense of relief. The road ahead would still be difficult, but they had taken the first step toward justice and healing. That evening, back at the Hardings' home, Claire and Lila sat together in the living room, the box of their parents' belongings resting between them. We did it, Lila said softly. Claire nodded, her eyes distant. But it's not over yet. There's still so much to process. We'll figure it out, Lila said, her voice firm. Together. Claire smiled, the warmth of Lila's words sinking into her heart. For the first time in years, she felt a sense of hope not just for herself, but for the bond they were rebuilding. The locket around her neck felt heavier now, its meaning deepened by the truths they had uncovered. As she traced its edges with her fingers, she thought of their mother's journal, her father's letters, and the life they had lost. But she also thought of the life they could create, a life built on love, resilience, and the courage to face the past. The morning after their confrontation with Victor Kane, the Hardings' home was steeped in quiet reflection. Sunlight filtered through the lace curtains, dappling the hardwood floor in soft patterns. Claire sat at the kitchen table, her fingers wrapped around a warm cup of tea, the steam curling upward like fleeting whispers of hope. Across from her, Lila scrolled through her phone, trying to find updates on Kane's surrender. He did it, Lila said finally, breaking the silence. Kane turned himself in early this morning. Claire's grip on her mug tightened. A part of her felt relief, but another part remained unsettled, the weight of the past refusing to fully release its hold. Good, Claire said quietly, her voice steady but tinged with exhaustion. It's the least he could do. The sisters had stayed up late the previous night, talking about what they had learned and what it meant for their family. They had combed through the letters and ledger from the wooden box again, searching for any other details that might shed light on their parents' final days. The revelations were raw, but as painful as they were, they also brought clarity. Their father had made mistakes, yes, but he had acted out of love and desperation. Their mother had carried the weight of her own fears while fiercely protecting her daughters. I still can't believe how close we came to never knowing any of this, Lila said, setting her phone down. Claire nodded, her gaze distant. I keep thinking about Mom's journal, how she kept writing even when things were falling apart. Like she wanted to make sure we had something, no matter what. The sisters sat in companionable silence, the weight of their shared history a tangible presence between them. Later that day, they decided to revisit the Merrick farm, this time with Father Allen. They needed his perspective, his steady presence as they processed the fragments of their past. The drive out was quieter this time, the urgency of their last trip replaced with a solemn determination. As they pulled up to the overgrown property, Claire noticed the windmill turning lazily in the breeze, its familiar creak a haunting echo of her childhood. Everything feels smaller than I remember, Claire said as they stepped out of the car, her boots crunching against the gravel. Things always do, Father Allen replied, his voice kind. The three of them walked the property, retracing the steps Claire and Lila had taken days earlier. They stopped at the spot where they had unearthed the wooden box, the disturbed earth now marked only by a faint indentation. Father Allen knelt down, running his fingers over the ground as if he could feel the history beneath it. Your parents left this for you, he said, looking up at the sisters. Not just the box, but the memories, the love. Even in the darkest times, they wanted to preserve that for you. Claire swallowed hard, her eyes stinging. I wish I could remember more, she said. It's like there are pieces missing, just out of reach. Sometimes memories come back when we least expect them, Father Allen said. But even if they don't, what matters is what you carry forward: the love, the lessons, the resilience. Lila stepped closer, her hand resting lightly on Claire's arm. We still have each other, she said softly. Claire nodded, the truth of Lila's words settling in her chest. Back at the house that evening, Claire found herself alone in the Hardings' small guest room. She sat cross-legged on the bed, the journal resting in her lap. Flipping through the pages, she reread her mother's words, letting them wash over her like a balm. One entry stood out, written just days before the fire. Even when the world feels like it's closing in, I look at my girls and see endless possibilities. Annie's courage and Emily's kindness, they are my guiding lights. If anything happens to me, I hope they remember that they are stronger together than apart. Claire traced the faded ink with her fingers, her throat tightening. Her mother had believed in her and Lila in their bond, in their future even when faced with unimaginable fear. The sound of footsteps drew Claire's attention. Lila appeared in the doorway, holding 2 mugs of cocoa. "Thought you could use this," Lila said, offering one to Claire. "Thanks," Claire said, taking the mug and gesturing for Lila to sit beside her. They sat in silence for a while, sipping their cocoa. The warmth of the drink and Lila's presence wrapped around Claire like a comforting blanket. "Do you think they'd be proud of us?" Lila asked suddenly, her voice quiet. Claire looked at her sister, her heart aching with both love and sorrow. "I think they'd be more than proud," she said. "I think they'd be relieved knowing we're still here, still fighting for what matters." Lila nodded, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "I'm glad we found each other again," she said, "even if it took all of this to make it happen." "Me too," Claire said, her voice thick with emotion. The following week, the sisters began the process of filing an official report with the authorities, detailing the evidence they had uncovered about Kane and his associates. Detective Harris, the officer assigned to their case, listened carefully as they recounted their findings, his expression a mixture of concern and determination. "This isn't just about your family," Detective Harris said when they finished. "If Kane was involved in other fires or crimes, this could open up a much larger investigation." Claire felt a surge of hope. "Does that mean other families might get justice too?" "It's possible," Harris said, "but it'll take time. These things always do." As they left the station, Claire felt a sense of closure beginning to take root. The road ahead was still uncertain, but they had taken a step toward accountability and healing. That night, back at the Hardings' home, the sisters gathered with Mrs. Harding for dinner. The atmosphere was lighter than it had been in days, the shared meal a reminder of the importance of connection and community. As they sat around the table, Mrs. Harding reached for Claire's hand, her gaze warm and reassuring. "You've been through so much," she said, "but look at you standing tall, supporting each other. That's what matters most." Claire felt tears prick her eyes. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. As the evening wore on, laughter filled the room, mingling with the clink of dishes and the crackle of the fireplace. For the first time in years, Claire felt a sense of peace. The shadows of the past hadn't disappeared, but they no longer loomed as heavily. Instead, they had become part of the tapestry of her life, a reminder of both loss and resilience, pain and love. As Claire and Lila prepared for bed, Claire paused at the window, looking out at the moonlit street. She touched the locket around her neck, feeling its familiar weight. "We're going to be okay," she said softly, the words as much for herself as for Lila. Lila smiled, wrapping an arm around her sister. "Yes," she said, "we are." The days that followed were a blur of interviews and paperwork as Claire and Lila worked with Detective Harris to untangle the web of crimes tied to Victor Kane and his associates. The pieces of their family's story were finally being stitched into a larger narrative, one that stretched far beyond the Merrick farm. Though it was exhausting, there was a strange comfort in the process. Each signature, each statement felt like reclaiming a piece of their lives that had been stolen. One brisk afternoon, Claire stood in front of the Merrick farm again, her breath clouding in the crisp air. The trees lining the driveway swayed in the wind, their bare branches creaking softly. Lila was at the Hardings' house, catching up on work, but Claire had felt an irresistible pull to return alone. She stepped onto the porch, the weathered wood groaning beneath her boots. The door hung slightly ajar, and she pushed it open with a quiet creak. The inside of the house was as she remembered it, empty and decaying, yet alive with memories. She could almost hear the laughter of her younger self and Lila echoing through the halls, their mother calling them to dinner, their father humming as he worked on repairs. Her footsteps echoed as she moved through the rooms, her fingers trailing along the faded wallpaper. In what had once been the kitchen, Claire paused, staring at the burnt edges of the countertop. It was here that the fire had first taken hold. The flames that had consumed their home started small, then spread with devastating speed. Kneeling by the counter, Claire traced a faint mark carved into the wood, a heart, with 2 initials inside. E and J, her parents' initials. "I didn't even know this was here," she whispered. Her chest tightened with emotion, but as the ache grew, so did a quiet resolve. This house, this land, it wasn't just a place of loss. It was a place of love, of roots, of beginnings. That evening, back at the Hardings' house, Claire shared her discovery with Lila. "We should fix it up," Claire said, her eyes bright with determination. "Fix it up?" Lila asked, her brow furrowing. "The farm," Claire said. "It's still ours, isn't it? What if we made it livable again? What if we turned it into something good?" Lila hesitated, her gaze flickering to the stack of documents they had brought back from the detective's office. "It's a big project, Claire. And after everything we've been through, are you sure?" Claire nodded. "That land was the heart of our family. It still is. I don't want it to just be a memory of what we lost. I want it to be a memory of what we can build." Lila's lips curved into a small smile. "You've got that fire in your eyes again," she said. "The same one Mom used to have." Claire smiled back, her heart swelling with gratitude. "So, will you help me?" Lila sighed dramatically, but her grin gave her away. "Of course. You're not doing this without me." The next morning, the sisters drove to the farm with Mrs. Harding in tow, armed with notebooks, cameras, and determination. They walked the property, noting what needed immediate attention and what could wait. "The barn's foundation looks solid," Mrs. Harding said, tapping her walking stick against the wooden beams. "You could convert this into something beautiful, a studio, or even a guest house." Claire and Lila exchanged a glance, the wheels of possibility already turning. The main house needed more work. The fire had left scars on nearly every surface, but beneath the damage was the skeleton of a home waiting to be restored. As they stood in what had once been the living room, Lila turned to Claire. "What about the cost? This isn't going to be cheap." Claire bit her lip, her gaze wandering to the charred beams overhead. "I've been thinking about that," she said. "We could start small, do what we can ourselves, and save the big repairs for later. Maybe we could even apply for grants or loans." "Crowdfunding," Mrs. Harding suggested. "People love a good story about resilience. You'd be surprised how many would want to help." The idea took root, and by the time they returned to the Hardings' house, Claire and Lila were drafting a plan. Over the next few weeks, the sisters threw themselves into the project with single-minded focus. They launched an online fundraiser, sharing their story with a mix of vulnerability and hope. Donations began to trickle in, accompanied by messages of encouragement from strangers who had been moved by their journey. "Your parents would be so proud of you," one donor wrote. Claire read the message aloud, her throat tight with emotion. "I hope they would," she said softly. As the restoration began, so did the healing. The farm became a gathering place, not just for the sisters, but for the community that rallied around them. One Saturday, a group of volunteers arrived with tools and supplies, ready to lend a hand. Among them were familiar faces: Mrs. Harding, Father Allen, and even Detective Harris, who traded his badge for a hammer. The barn was the first to transform. Together, they replaced broken beams, sanded down rough edges, and gave the structure a fresh coat of paint. When it was finished, Claire and Lila stood in the center of the barn, their laughter echoing as they admired their handiwork. "It doesn't even look like the same place," Lila said, running her hand along the smooth, newly painted wall. "It's better," Claire said, her smile radiant. As winter approached, the sisters turned their attention to the house. The repairs were slower and more challenging, but each step forward felt like reclaiming a piece of their family's legacy. One evening, as they painted the living room, Claire paused to look out the window. The sky was streaked with shades of pink and orange, the colors reflecting on the snow-dusted ground. "Do you remember how Mom used to make hot chocolate after we played in the snow?" Claire asked, her voice tinged with nostalgia. Lila smiled. "With the cinnamon on top," she said, "and Dad would always steal a sip when he thought we weren't looking." They laughed, the sound filling the room with warmth. By the time Christmas arrived, the farm was far from finished, but it felt alive again. The sisters decided to host a small gathering in the barn, stringing lights and setting up a makeshift table with mismatched chairs. As their friends and neighbors filled the space, the barn seemed to glow not just from the lights, but from the sense of community that had grown around it. Claire stood near the doorway, her gaze sweeping over the scene. Lila joined her, holding 2 mugs of cider. "We did it," Lila said, her voice soft but filled with pride. "We're doing it," Claire corrected, smiling as she took the mug. As the evening wore on, Claire felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. The shadows of the past still lingered, but they no longer defined her. The farm was more than just a place. It was a symbol of resilience, of love, of the unbreakable bond between sisters. Snow fell softly over the Merrick farm on Christmas morning, blanketing the newly restored barn and house in a peaceful hush. The gentle light of dawn illuminated the land, casting long shadows across the fields. Claire stood on the porch, her arms wrapped around herself, watching the world awaken in quiet stillness. The barn, its fresh coat of red paint glowing faintly against the white landscape, stood as a testament to the months of hard work and healing. The house was still far from complete, but it was livable now, a home they could truly call their own. Claire heard the door creak open behind her. Turning, she saw Lila step onto the porch, bundled in a thick sweater, her cheeks pink from the cold. She held 2 steaming mugs of coffee, offering one to Claire. "Merry Christmas," Lila said, her voice warm. "Merry Christmas," Claire replied, taking the mug. They stood in companionable silence, sipping their coffee and watching the snowfall. "It doesn't feel real, does it?" Lila said after a while. Claire smiled faintly. "No, it doesn't, but it's ours now, and that's what matters." Later that morning, the sisters began preparing for their first Christmas in the barn. It was a modest celebration, but every detail carried meaning. Strings of handmade garlands decorated the walls, and an old cedar table, donated by Mrs. Harding, stood at the center, set with mismatched plates and silverware. Father Allen arrived first, carrying a loaf of fresh bread and a smile that warmed the chilly air. Mrs. Harding followed, bringing a pot of stew that filled the barn with a rich, savory aroma. As more friends and neighbors arrived, the space came alive with laughter and conversation. Even Detective Harris made an appearance, bringing a box of cookies from his wife and sharing stories of his own family. The sisters moved through the crowd, greeting each guest with gratitude and joy. "Everyone here," Claire said to Lila at one point, "they're the reason we've come this far. I never imagined we'd have this kind of support." "Me neither," Lila said, her voice soft. "But maybe that's what Mom and Dad wanted for us, to find our way back to people who cared." As the meal began, Father Allen stood to give a blessing. His words were simple but powerful, a prayer of gratitude for resilience, community, and the healing power of love. Claire glanced around the barn as he spoke, her heart swelling with emotion. The journey to this moment had been long and painful, but it had also been transformative. When the meal was finished, Claire and Lila shared a quiet moment at the far end of the barn, looking out over the group. "I think they'd be proud of us," Lila said, her voice barely above a whisper. Claire nodded, her eyes glistening. "I think so too." As evening fell, the sisters found themselves alone in the barn, the last of their guests having departed. They sat side by side at the table, the remnants of their meal spread before them. "Do you remember the Christmas after the fire?" Lila asked suddenly. Claire frowned, the memory coming into focus. "I remember it was just the 2 of us," she said. "We didn't have much, just a small tree and a couple of gifts from the Hardings. But we still made it special," Lila said, We lit candles and stayed up late talking. You even made me laugh by singing carols off-key. Claire chuckled, the sound filling the quiet barn. I forgot about that. Lila smiled, her expression soft. Even when everything was falling apart, you always found a way to hold things together. I don't know about that, Claire said, her voice tinged with self-doubt. I do, Lila said firmly. And I think Mom and Dad saw it too. Claire looked down at the locket around her neck, the familiar weight grounding her. She opened it, revealing the tiny photograph of their parents. They gave us so much, Claire said, even when they didn't have much themselves. And now we're giving something back, Lila said, her hand resting gently on Claire's arm. Before heading inside for the night, the sisters walked the property one last time, the snow crunching softly beneath their boots. They stopped at the edge of the field, with the land stretched out like a blank canvas. I've been thinking, Claire said, her breath visible in the cold air. What if we planted something here? A garden? Or maybe an orchard? Something that will grow and last. Lila smiled. I like that. It's a way to move forward while honoring the past. Claire nodded, a sense of peace settling over her. We've come so far, Lila. I didn't think we'd ever feel whole again. We're not just whole, Lila said, her voice filled with quiet conviction. We're stronger. That night, as the sisters sat by the fire in the house, Claire found herself writing in her mother's journal. The pages had once seemed untouchable, a sacred connection to their mother's voice. But now, they felt like an invitation to continue the story, to add their own chapters. She wrote about the barn, the community that had rallied around them, and the plans they had for the future. When she finished, she handed the journal to Lila. Your turn, she said with a smile. Lila hesitated, then took the journal, her expression softening as she began to write. The flames crackled in the hearth, casting a warm glow over the room. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the farm in quiet beauty. As the year came to an end, Claire and Lila stood on the porch together, watching the first rays of dawn stretch across the horizon. This is home, Claire said, her voice filled with quiet certainty. Lila nodded, her smile bright. It always was. The locket around Claire's neck felt lighter now, its meaning transformed. It was no longer just a reminder of what they had lost, it was a symbol of what they had found. The threads that bound them, love, resilience, and the courage to face the past, were stronger than ever, weaving a future filled with hope. Thank you for following Claire and Lila's journey of love, resilience, and rediscovery. If their story has touched your heart, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support helps us continue sharing powerful narratives of hope, healing, and the unbreakable bonds of family. Together, we can inspire more hearts and light up the darkest paths. Subscribe today and join us in spreading stories that matter.